Hello everybody, my name is YujimboXD and welcome to the channel, and welcome to a list. So this week I figured we could try something a little bit different and discuss the state of the base game. So specifically I wanted to rank all 84 starting countries and find out which one is the best. And when I say the best, I don't necessarily mean the most powerful country in the game, I mean the one that's the most fun to play as. And generally speaking, how fun a country is to play as is usually based on its focus tree. But in the base game, not every country has a focus tree, so just because a country doesn't have a focus tree, I don't think it necessarily makes it a bad country to play as. Some countries have enough starting perks that you can get along just fine and make a fun game out of it as long as you know what you're doing. So I came up with a short list of criteria to judge these countries by. First, obviously, is a focus tree. If you have a focus tree and it's good, you're probably going up higher on the list. And if it has a generic one, it's probably going lower on the list. Second is your starting position. Are you a big country that can bully all your neighbors? Or are you a tiny country sandwiched between two superpowers? Third is economy. So this is how many starting factories you have. And the best thing about starting with a lot of factories is you can build more factories. So the more you have to access at the start, the better off you'll be. Fourth is manpower. How many troops you can draw from your population is going to determine how much you can expand. But bonus points if you have a puppet you can steal divisions from, and having a large starting army can also be a huge contributing factor to your success early on. And lastly, we have resources. If you have a lot of resources to start with or that you can trade with, that's going to help out your economy a lot and will allow you to produce more goods faster. But it's worth pointing out that a good focus tree will make all these other things irrelevant. Alright, now that we've established the rules, on to the rankings. So there are actually several countries that are very similar to each other, so I've decided to group a bunch of them together just to save some time. So first up, we have the Baltic boys, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So all three of these countries have a very similar focus tree, with only slight variations on them. But the nice part is any one of them can annex their neighbors and just gain all their manpower. So just because Russia's on your border doesn't mean you have to be scared of them. But I will say Estonia is the better of the three because they can annex Finland for free. So while I wouldn't recommend them for beginners and they don't start off very strong, I actually think they're the dark horses of Europe and they're actually a lot of fun to play as and can become very powerful if you know what you're doing. So I'll put them in B for Baltic. Next, I have what I call my Middle Eastern group: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. None of them have a focus tree, but all of them start off on a line, so there are opportunities to flip to a different type of ideology and expand. And if I had to pick one of the three, I'd pick Iran. They have more manpower and factories than the other two combined, but if I had to play in the Middle East, I'd rather be Turkey. So they're all going in the C tier. Next up, we have what I call the Minor China Warlord group. So these include Xinjiang, Zibishenma, Shanxi, Yunnan, and the Guangxi clique. All of them have an identical focus tree and it's a little underwhelming. Let's just say if you want to play in China, there are some better options. But it's worth pointing out that the Guangxi are a little bit more unique because they start off with more manpower than the other warlords combined. So that will at least put them in the C tier. As for the other four, they're going in the D tier. Jumping to the other side of the world, I have what I call the South American Minor League. This includes Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Venezuela. All of these countries got left out of the Trial of Allegiance update and are still shackled with the basic focus tree, which is really sad because Venezuela, being the only fascist country in South America, really deserves one. It's South America, they have no focus tree. I'm not sure what, but maybe somebody can find the fun. So they're all going to go into C tier. And they're only going that high because I'm putting Ecuador in D tier, as it stands out for being uniquely bad for having less manpower and factories than everyone else. And the last group I have for you is my Central America is Bad group. This includes El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Once again, none of these countries have focus trees, and unlike the South American countries, they have even less factory and manpower, with Cuba being the one exception that has a decent amount of manpower. But this area is really the hellscape of fun. You have Haiti and the Dominican Republic competing for worst country in Hearts of Iron. Not only do they have low factory and manpowers, they have the added problem of starting off in an island, so you then also have to build up a navy to do anything. But there's one country that makes them look like amateurs when it comes to bad countries, so we might as well talk about them now, and that's Liberia. It has even less manpower and factories, and starts off surrounded by superpowers, and has no navy to go anywhere. So in my opinion, Liberia is the worst country in the game, and in fact, you have to be a special breed of psycho to play them. So all of Central America is going in the E tier, except for Cuba, which I'll I'll put in D tier. And Liberia will get its own special tier because you have to be a masochist to want to play them. Alright, but that does it for all the groups I have, so on to the individual rankings. And first up, we have Afghanistan. They have no focus tree, they have very low manpower and low factories, and their only real option for expansion is to go into Iran, who already starts off more powerful than them. So they're going into the D tier. Next, we have Albania, another minor nation with no focus tree, low manpower, and low factories. And their starting position isn't great because everyone that surrounds them is more powerful. Getting annexed is part of the Albania experience, so I'm going to put them in the E tier. And they only stayed out of the pain tier because in theory you could annex some of your neighbors. Next up, we have Argentina, which we looked at not too long ago on the channel when we did our Trial of Allegiance review, and at one time were almost considered a world power. So not a bad country, all things considered. I'll put them in the B tier. Probably my second favorite country to play in South America. But next up, we have Australia. And while they do have a focus tree, and they do start off in a pretty safe position, their lack of manpower and resources really do hurt them. But hey, at least you're not New Zealand, and starts off just as weak as any Central American country. So I'll put Australia in C tier, and since we mentioned it, New Zealand will go in E tier. Next up, we have Austria, which starts off with a pretty decent sized army, and a handful of factories. But if you're playing with historical on, you're almost guaranteed to get annexed by Germany or have to fight a war with them. And its lack of a focus tree is a bit of a bummer too. There's a lot better choices in Central Europe, so I'm going to put them in D tier. Next up, we have Belgium, a decent sized army and manpower and a decent amount of factories. But the lack of a focus tree and the fact that you might get steamrolled by Germany really puts a damper into things. So I'm going to put them in C tier. Next, we have Bhutan, or sometimes as it's known, the Thunder Dragon Empire. And while it has no manpower, factories, or a focus tree, there's actually a unique strategy you can do where you can flip to communism and get involved in the Chinese Civil War, and you're able to puppet them and get a lot of land from them. So that's the only thing that keeps this country interesting. Actually, come to think of it, all those things I just said also apply to Nepal and Tibet. But that unique strategy is the only thing keeping them out of the E tier. Instead, I will upgrade all three to the D tier. Next, we have Brazil, my favorite country to play in South America. They had a focus tree before, but with Trial of Allegiance, they got an even new, bigger, beefier one. So Brazil is unquestionably the strongest starting nation in South America. They have the most factories and manpower, so you can either dominate South America, or you can try and be a bro to the world and help out the allies. Both are pretty fun. But let's not kid ourselves, it's still a South American country, so there's only so much fun you can have with it. So it'll go in B tier with Argentina. Next, we have British Malaya, which may not seem like much on paper considering it only has one factory to start, but it does have a decent amount of manpower, and you can probably count on the British Navy to help you out. But the real treasure is the amount of resources it has. You have almost the entire world's supply of rubber and tungsten, with the only downside that you might get invaded by Japan. But a lack of a focus tree will put it down in the C tier. Next, we have Bulgaria, and we finally have our first very good focus tree. Not only does it have multiple paths you can go down, they're all very fleshed out, and I can't say there's a bad one in the bunch. The only thing stopping it from reaching real greatness is that it is one of the most underpowered states in the Balkans to start, but you are able to turn that around pretty quickly. While it's a very excellent focus tree, we still haven't gotten to the S tier yet, but we do have our first A tier. Next, we have China. You start off with a huge army and a lot of manpower, but you're really gonna need that because Japan is coming for you. And they got the most fleshed out focus tree from the Waking the Tiger DLC. So yeah, I think it goes without saying China's a very powerful nation, and their focus tree isn't too bad either. So I'm gonna put them in the A tier. Next, we have British Raj, or India, and they got their own anemic focus tree and Together for Victory. But what does save them is their large manpower pool. But the only downside of India is it takes a while to break free from the British control, so you can't really unlock your true potential until near the end of the game, which really holds them back. So I'm going to put them in a C tier. Next, we have Chile. Starts off with a decent amount of manpower, and was one of the lucky South American countries to be graced with a larger focus tree in the last DLC update. And there's actually one or two focus trees I even wanted to look at on this channel, but I haven't gotten to yet. So based on my preconceived notion of what I think it will be like, I'm going to put them at B. Alright, that puts us exactly at the halfway mark, and I may have underestimated just how many 84 countries are. So I think I'm going to go back to grouping them. This was always meant to be a high-level look at each country anyways. So if you want a more in-depth look, let me know down in the comments below. I'll do like an hour version of this where I just look at the focus trees. Alright, next we return to the Far East with Communist China, which if you had to pick a Chinese warlord, this is probably one of the better paths to choose from. Mostly because they already start communist and you can get some help from Russia, but you're still not as powerful as regular China. But hey, at least you're not Mongolia, that has a frankly abysmal amount of manpower and factories. So while you could probably take some land in China, it is going to be a struggle, but not the amount of suffering Manchukuo goes through. They are probably the weakest faction here in China, China, with a whole whopping 1 factory to start with, and just like Mongolia, has no focus tree. Unlike its cooler older brother, Manchukuo, which has a pretty decent sized focus tree for a Chinese faction, especially considering they start as a puppet to Japan. There's actually a very fun path with them where you can help Japan take over China and then betray Japan, and there's even an achievement for it. So they are a very solid country to pick. But we can't talk about East Asia without talking about Japan. So they start off with a lot of manpower and a decent sized economy, so you do have plenty of opportunities to expand. I will say the biggest thing holding Japan back is their focus tree. While it offers you a little bit of variety, they aren't very deep or involved trees. Also, they heavily rely on their navy to expand, which I've always found to be a little bit tedious. But hey, maybe you can use that navy to slap around the Philippines, who actually start the game as a US puppet, whose position is made worse by the fact that if they have any hope of expanding, they need to build a navy, which means you'll likely have to fight Japan, or if you want to break free, you might have to fight the US, and you basically have no chance against their navies. But if I wanted to pick the real wild card of the Southeast Asia, I'd pick Siam. They start in close proximity of some easy resources to pick up, and I think they actually have plenty of opportunity to expand. Sadly though, they just have the generic focus tree. So where does that put us? I'm going to put Communist China at B tier, Mongolia in D tier, Manchukuo in E tier, Manchukuo in a surprising A tier, and maybe even more surprisingly, Japan is going into a B tier. Sorry, get a better focus tree. Philippines I'm putting into D tier, and while I would put Siam in a B tier with Japan, it doesn't have a focus tree, so it's going into C tier. Alright, now jumping back to the Middle East and Africa. First up we have Turkey, who got a giant focus tree in the Battle of the Bosphorus, but I'm fairly certain they were drunk when they were making it. Not only do you have to navigate the spaghetti path, but each of these focus trees ends in really weird stuff like having to go to war with Japan, or claiming your crown jewel Finland. But at least you have a good sized army to start with. Some people say they're weird, but I think that's what makes them unique. Unlike these two, Yemen and Oman, who Oman in particular is so bland they couldn't even get their own flag. They share one of the Sultanate of Asua, who we'll get to in a moment. But neither of these countries have focus trees, and they have an abysmal amount of manpower and factories, but Yemen is slightly better. Now, I did mention it a moment ago, and you might be asking yourself, what the heck is a Sultanate of Asua? Well, it's that country that Italy usually annexes in about the first 3 months of the game and gets destroyed almost immediately in the Ethiopian War, who up until a few moments ago, I didn't even realize had a focus tree. So at least they have that going for them, but they have pretty much nothing else going on upstairs. But if you want to play the coolest kid in Africa, you gotta pick Ethiopia, who got a pretty good focus tree a few years ago, and was one of the first countries I ever played here on the channel. So admittedly, I do have a bit of a soft spot for Cowboy John, but if you ever wanted to claim you got good at defense in Hearts of Iron, play Ethiopia. And the last country we have in Africa is South Africa. Decent amount of manpower and army to start, and some factories, but their focus tree is a little underwhelming. There are better choices when it comes to being a British puppet. I'm not a big fan of South Africa, because even if you want to expand, you're going to have to take a lot of land with no resources, so you're going to spend a lot of energy not really getting much. So let's look at the scoreboard. I'm going to put Turkey at C tier, Yemen and Oman in E tier, Ashura gets up to D tier just because they have a focus tree, Ethiopia is definitely going in the A tier, and South Africa will go in the D tier. So next, let's take a look at Mexico. Pretty good size army, manpower pool, and factories to start. And not a bad focus tree too. This focus tree basically allows you to annex most of Central America while you prepare for your big war against the United States. I will say the downside of this is it is the last thing in your focus tree, which means by then the US will be very powerful because it'll be late in the game. So good luck. But finishing off South America, we have Paraguay and Uruguay, who were given minor focus tree updates in the Trial of Allegiance update. Both their trees are pretty similar, but don't offer a lot of variety, and they're pretty weak nations to boot. But I will say Uruguay is probably the better of the two. So I'm going to put them both down in D tier, and Mexico will go in a B tier. Up next, for no particular reason, Canada, which thanks to their starting location, they are probably my favorite UK puppet to play as. Since you're allowed to build up in relative safety, it allows you time to get really powerful. You can get so powerful, in fact, you can even take down Germany on your own. The only downside is their focus tree is mediocre at best. But if you want to talk the real bane of Germany's existence, you need to talk about the UK. Yes, this cheeky little island in the Atlantic is probably my third favorite country to play as. With a strong starting army and strong economy, they are in an incredibly strong position. Just close enough to Europe to interact with it, but safe enough on their large island with their huge navy that as long as you have some idea of what you're doing, it's almost impossible to be invaded. Also, they have a good-sized focus tree with well-fleshed-out alternate paths. My personal favorite is blowing up your empire and reforming it. And while we're at it, we might as well talk about the Irish man in the room. No focus tree, low manpower, low factories, but I don't know, maybe you can get some submarines and do a naval invasion on the UK. That might be funny. So, I will put Canada at A tier, I'm going to put the UK at S tier, and Ireland will go down into D tier. But it's finally nice to have an S on the board. Next, let's take a look across the water at the Nordic countries, who all got a big update in the Arms Against Tyranny DLC. All of them have varying degrees size of political focus trees, and all of them share the Nordic cooperation tree. So basically any one of these countries can form the Nordic Brotherhood. But Finland was given the most mechanics in that DLC update, but Sweden has always been the most powerful of all of them. But let's not forget the black sheep in the room, Iceland. Do you like islands in the middle of nowhere with zero military infrastructure? Well, then you might enjoy Iceland, but at least it does have a focus tree for some reason. So while their flags may be similar, not all Nordic countries were made equal. So I'm going to put Denmark in B for no other reason that I like their Viking path. Norway I'm going to put at C, Sweden I'm going to put at B, Finland I'm also going to put at B, and Iceland I'm going to put in D tier, only saved by the fact that it has a focus tree. Alright, back to the Baltics. First, we have Romania, who does have the strongest starting army out of everyone in this little region, along with a decent sized economy, but I would say their focus tree could use some improvement. It's looking pretty slim compared to some other ones. Oh, and get cozy with the Russians or be prepared to fight them. But right next to them, we have Hungary, who must have eaten Austria's focus tree because they're the ones who got the focus to restore the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is what I assume most people want to do. And yeah, it's fun. And to their north, we have Czechoslovakia, who sadly has a pretty shallow focus tree. But you are going to have to make friends with Germany or fight them. But at least you have a decent sized economy for building forts. And moving south now, we have Yugoslavia, who's been graced with a slightly larger focus tree, with some decent options. But my advice is to make friends with your neighbors, because holding off both Germany and Italy is incredibly hard. I actually find it harder to survive as them than Ethiopia. But the last Baltic country we have is Greece. So while their focus tree does look large, it is pretty mediocre. Especially if you're trying to go for the 3 Romes achievement. You really need more bonuses to help you out. That achievement is really hard. So having a better focus tree might have helped me out. So where does that put us? I'm going to put Romania in the C tier, Czechoslovakia in the C tier, Yugoslavia in the B tier, Hungary in the A tier, and Greece in the D tier. So finishing up the minor leaguers of Europe, first we have Poland, who has a good sized focus tree with lots of options. While you're playing on historical, you will have to hold off the German hordes and the Russians, but at the end of the day, it'll make you a better Hearts of Iron player and put hair on your chest. Or you could always become a flunky. Next, we have Switzerland, and don't let its size deceive you, this little country packs a punch. If anyone tries to mess with you, they'll learn the pain of attacking through mountain tiles, not to mention you have a ton of manpower. Kind of a weird looking focus tree that it's one single tree with just a few branches, but that's good enough for me. Next, we have Spain and Portugal. So while Spain's focus tree looks huge, it's actually 2 focus trees in a trench coat, because you have the fascist Democrat path on one side and the communist monarchist path on the other. But they do end up fighting a civil war that leaves them in a weakened state afterwards, so that really hurts their potential, but I do recommend playing them at least once. And then we have Portugal, whose focus tree actually looks a little bit like a mini Spanish focus tree, but being that they actually have some colonies and a little bit of a navy, you can actually do a shocking amount as Portugal, so not a bad country overall. Now jumping back north to the Benelux region, we have the Netherlands, whose main objective is mostly to just stay alive. And they have a decent sized focus tree, but I can tell you from experience, you want to stay on Germany's good side if you don't want to get invaded. And overall, they are slightly more powerful than Belgium, for what it's worth. And that's mostly due to the fact that they have a resource-rich puppet, the Dutch East Indies, who doesn't have a focus tree. But like I said, it has a ton of resources and it has a lot of manpower. So even after Germany takes out the Netherlands, you can still live on as Indonesia. But we can't forget about the most important country in Europe, Luxembourg. Yes, the one-tile wonder. They don't have a focus tree, but they still manage to have more factories and manpower than other people. This is another one for the pain tier, because even if you manage to hold off Germany, you're going to have a hell of a time ending that war. So let's update the rankings. I'm putting Poland at A tier, Switzerland at B tier, Spain and Portugal at C tier, the Netherlands at C tier, their puppet the Dutch East Indies at D tier, and Luxembourg is going in the pain tier. I know you can win as Luxembourg, but you gotta hate yourself to want to go through that. And now we can finally discuss the major powers of Europe. They start off in a pretty strong position with a lot of manpower and factories, and even a few colonies. And the nice thing about their focus tree is they have some of the most fully fleshed out alternate paths you can go down. I recommend the communist path, but really all of them are a lot of fun. Next, we have France, who their focus tree isn't as impressive, and neither is their economy as Italy, but the fact that they have colonies all over the place means that if you can survive survive and hold off against Germany, you will have a ton of world projection power, equal to that of the UK. And it's really not that hard to hold them off if you know what you're doing. But I will say the real joy of France comes as playing as fascist France, who is just terrifyingly powerful, even more so than Germany. But speaking of Germany, while I know they may be a lot of people's favorite country, and undoubtedly one of the most powerful starting nations in the game, but for me, every time I think of them, I think of this disappointing focus tree. When your focus tree is smaller than Bulgaria's, you have a problem. So that is going to hurt Germany in the rankings. And next we have the Red Menace, or the Soviet Union as they're known. They got a pretty decent update to their focus tree and no step back. And they even got some fun mechanics to go along with it, like paranoia. The only thing I'd like to have more out of Russia is more fleshed out alternative paths. But overall, it's Russia. You have a ton of manpower, a ton of factories, a ton of resources, a ton of land, and a ton of enemies. What more can you ask for? How about a nice sweet puppet, Tana Tuva? So we got some big winners on the board this time. Italy's going in S tier, Germany's going in A tier, France is going in S tier, Soviet Union is going in S tier, and I'm going to put Tana Tuva in its own class above S. And no, I will not elaborate. But I saved the best for last. Have you figured it out yet? It's the United States. Yes, there's no place like home. And that's probably why I played this country more than any other on the channel. So while admittedly their focus tree is a little underwhelming, I would like to see them have a more fleshed out alternate history path. But they do have some other things to make up for it, like a turbocharged economy and a ton of manpower that you can eventually draw from. And the best part, it comes with 2 oceans. And I can honestly say, in all my 2,000 hours of Hearts of Iron, I have never seen the AI invade the US in the base game. So if you are new to Hearts of Iron, pick the US. That's my recommendation. It pretty much comes with everything you need to succeed right away. And your options for shenanigans are endless. So I think it goes without saying, they're also in the S tier. But okay, I did some reshuffling inside the tiers so we can basically see from best to worst now, where we have the US at the top and Liberia all the way down at the bottom. So that is my tier list for all starting countries in Hearts of Iron 4. So what do you think? Do you agree or disagree? You can let me know down in the comments below. And if you made it this far, why don't you consider subscribing? It doesn't cost you anything. So that is where we'll leave it off for tonight. Thank you all so much for watching. And no, I'm not going to tell you why I put Tana Tuva up there. You're just gonna have to stick around and find out. Good night, everyone.